She was 73 years old, standing alone at Gate C-14 of Dallas, Fort Worth International Airport, clutching a worn leather handbag to her chest while the crowd swirled around her like a cold river around an ancient stone. Her name was Dorothy Mae Calloway. For 51 years she had poured every callus on her hands, every ache in her back, every sunrise and every heartbreak into 340 acres of East Texas farmland, red clay soil that had fed her family, buried her husband, raised her children, and held the shape of her entire life. And in the time it took her son and daughter-in-law to wave goodbye at that gate and turn away smiling, they had already set the machinery of theft into motion. But here is what Richard Calloway did not know about his own mother. He had spent 2 years manufacturing the story that she was fragile, confused, and incompetent, because a woman who appeared incompetent could be robbed without interference. He had arranged the trip to Scottsdale to get her out of the state while the forged deed was being filed with the county clerk. He had smiled at her in that airport and kissed her cheek, and he believed that he was watching a woman who had no idea what was happening. He was wrong. Inside Dorothy's old leather suitcase, tucked beneath the lining in the same hidden compartment where she had kept Gerald's most important letters, was the original 1975 farm deed to every acre of Calloway land. And standing 5 feet away, with a phone set to record audio and 3 years of documented observations saved in encrypted files, was Dorothy's granddaughter Claire, a 31-year-old paralegal from Austin with her grandmother's patience and a very long memory. By the time Judge Harold Mercer opened the manila folder on his bench in that Angelina County courtroom 8 weeks later, Richard Calloway had lost the farm, his freedom, his home in Frisco, and every illusion he had ever held about how this was going to end. Dorothy Mae Calloway had not lost a single acre. If you found out that your own family had sent your grandmother on a fake vacation so they could forge her signature and steal her land, would you call the police the same day? Or would you build the trap first and let them walk straight into it? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what you would do. And before we take you inside that courtroom, make sure you hit like and subscribe, because this story is only getting started. Dorothy Mae Calloway was born in 1951 in Nacogdoches County, Texas, the daughter of James Earl Simmons, a sharecropper who worked land that would never bear his name on any deed. She grew up understanding the difference between working a place and owning it. She watched her father leave before sunrise and come home after dark, and she watched the man who owned the land arrive twice a year to collect and leave without looking at anyone directly, and she had understood, not in words because she was only 8 years old, but in the specific permanent way that children understand things that mark them, that ownership was the difference between dignity and endurance. She met Gerald Calloway at a church social in Nacogdoches in 1973. He was a large, deliberate man with enormous hands and a bass voice that could anchor a choir, and he had the quality, rare in anyone, rarer still in a 22-year-old man, of making the person he was talking to feel like the only person in the room. They were married 6 months after they met, in the same church, with 40 people in attendance and Dorothy's mother's ring on her finger. 2 years after that, Gerald's father passed away and left them the farm, 340 acres outside of Lufkin, red clay soil and pine forest and a pond the color of iron in the morning light. The original farmhouse was a clapboard structure that had seen better decades, and Gerald and Dorothy spent the first 2 years of their ownership repairing it. New roof, new porch boards, new windows that didn't rattle when the wind came from the north. They built slowly and deliberately, the way people build when they know something is going to last. They grew soybeans on the cleared fields and raised a small cattle herd that Dorothy managed with an attention to detail that made their veterinarian remark, more than once, that she had better instincts than most ranchers he worked with. They put in a kitchen garden that supplied the house through summer and fall. They built the new farmhouse in 1988, a proper structure with a wraparound porch for bedrooms and a kitchen large enough to feed the kind of family Dorothy had always planned to have. They had 2 children. Richard Dean Calloway was born in 1975, the same year the deed was issued in their names, and Patricia Ann Calloway was born in 1979. Patricia grew up with her mother's attention and her father's stillness, and she left for the University of Oregon in 1997 and eventually settled in Portland with a husband who was a structural engineer and children who called their grandmother in Texas twice a week. Richard grew up differently. He had his father's size and his father's voice but not his father's relationship with patience or work. He was not a bad child exactly, but he was a child who understood from an early age that the land was worth something, and who never quite learned to feel about it the way his parents did, as home rather than asset. Gerald Calloway died of a heart attack on a Tuesday evening in March of 2019. He was sitting in his recliner watching the evening news, and Dorothy was in the kitchen finishing the dishes, and she came into the living room and knew immediately, not because she heard anything, but because the quality of the silence was different from any silence she had ever heard in that room before. She called 911. She sat beside him and held his hand while she waited. In the ambulance, she was very calm, because she had understood in that first moment of wrong silence that what was required of her now was not grief but endurance, and she had been practicing endurance her whole life. She buried him in the southwest corner of the property, in the shade of a stand of loblolly pines, next to his parents. She put a granite stone with his name and the years and a line from the 23rd Psalm. And then she went back to work, because the cattle needed feeding and the soybeans needed attention and the farm did not pause for grief any more than the sun paused for it. It was in the months after Gerald's death that Richard began to change. The change was gradual enough that someone who was not watching carefully might have mistaken it for filial concern. He called more often. He drove out from Dallas. He brought Sandra and the grandkids. He sat on the porch with Dorothy and drank her coffee and talked about the farm the way people talk about things they are estimating. He had conversations with real estate contacts in Lufkin and in Tyler. He discovered, through a colleague who worked with a regional land developer, that the Calloway property sat in a corridor that had been quietly attracting commercial interest for 2 years. Timber. Potential residential development. A county road expansion project that would increase access and therefore value considerably. The conservative estimate, delivered to Richard over lunch at a steakhouse in Dallas by a man whose firm had been buying East Texas acreage for 3 years, was $4 to $5 million. Richard drove home from that lunch and said to Sandra, across the island in their Frisco kitchen, "We need to figure out how to get Mom to sell." Sandra was standing at the counter with a glass of Chardonnay. She looked at her husband for a moment, and something moved across her face, a calculation that she dressed up quickly as concern. "She won't sell," Sandra said. "Not to us. Not directly." "No," Richard agreed. They were quiet for a moment. "We need her to think it's her idea," Sandra said finally. They began slowly and plausibly. Richard started raising the subject of Dorothy's isolation. Gently, carefully, always framed as worry. He mentioned, on visits, that the farmhouse was a lot of house for one person. He talked about the difficulty of managing a property of that size without Gerald. He introduced, delicately, the phrase estate planning, as though it were a kindness he was trying to offer rather than a process he was trying to initiate. Sandra's contribution was more insidious. She began calling Dorothy 3 times a week. She sent food, casseroles, pies, the kind of gestures that read as love and are accepted as such. She arrived for visits with a particular kind of gentle, searching attention that Dorothy would later describe to Claire as the way a doctor looks at you when they've already decided something is wrong. She asked Dorothy if she had taken her medication. Dorothy did not take daily medication, and widened her eyes just slightly when Dorothy said she didn't know what Sandra was referring to. She commented within Dorothy's hearing that Dorothy seemed a little foggy or a little forgetful today. She said these things in the tone of someone sharing a worry, not making an accusation, and they were designed to do exactly what they eventually did in the minds of anyone within earshot: plant the seed of doubt. Dorothy heard all of it. Dorothy understood all of it. She had spent 7 decades watching people manage each other, and she knew the difference between love and maneuvering. But she was also operating on incomplete information. She suspected Richard wanted the land, but she did not yet know how far he was willing to go to get it, and until she knew, she could not act. So she did what she had always done with things that required patience. She waited. She called Claire on a Sunday evening in late autumn, when the light outside was the particular low gold of an East Texas November, and she said what she had been thinking for months. "Baby, your Uncle Richard has got that look in his eye. The one your grandfather used to call counting chickens before the hen sits down. I need you to listen to me. I need you to remember what I'm telling you tonight, because I don't know exactly what he's planning, but whatever it is, he's been planning it for a while." Claire Calloway was at her kitchen table in Austin with a glass of water and a legal brief she had been reviewing. She set the brief down and gave her grandmother her full attention. "Tell me everything," she said. Claire was Patricia's oldest daughter, and she had spent her formative summers on the Calloway farm in a way that had shaped her more than any formal education. She had learned to read soil and weather from Gerald. She had learned to hold her ground from Dorothy. She had an undergraduate degree from UT Austin, and had fallen into paralegal work almost accidentally, discovering in the methodical architecture of legal documentation the same satisfaction other people found in more dramatic pursuits. She was not flashy or loud. She had a quality of stillness in difficult moments that her colleagues at the firm had learned to read as dangerous competence. She began keeping a private journal the week after Dorothy's call. Nothing dramatic, just dates, observations, patterns. She drove to the farm more frequently on weekends and found reasons to be present when Richard and Sandra visited. She sat in the background and listened to conversations with the practiced invisibility of a person who has learned that people reveal themselves most fully when they think no one important is paying attention. What she observed over the following months confirmed her grandmother's instincts and alarmed her considerably more. She watched Sandra steer conversations toward Dorothy's changing needs with the neighbors who came by. She watched Richard casually mention to Dorothy's longtime attorney, Harold Briggs, that the family was thinking about estate planning, and that they might be seeking new legal representation better equipped for that kind of complexity. She noticed that Richard had begun referring in conversations with Dorothy to a Lufkin attorney named Denton Cole, always casually, always framed as a helpful suggestion, always with the particular enthusiasm of a man who needs someone to appear trustworthy. She looked Denton Cole up. His firm was small and unremarkable, but one of his former clients, she found through a court records search, had been involved in a land transfer dispute 2 years earlier in Angelina County. The case had been settled out of court. Claire wrote down the case number. She called Harold Briggs and asked him, carefully and without revealing the full scope of her concern, whether he had heard from Richard about any planned changes to Dorothy's estate arrangements. Briggs paused for a long moment before answering. He told her that he had received an inquiry some months ago from a Denton Cole, asking general questions about the status of the Calloway land deed. He had provided no information, but the inquiry had unsettled him, and he said so, and Claire made note of that too. The trip to Scottsdale was announced in January. Richard called Dorothy with an elaborate brightness in his voice, explaining that he and Sandra had arranged a week at a resort spa as a gift, a chance for Dorothy to rest, to enjoy herself, to take a break from the responsibilities of the farm. He had already booked the flight. He had already made the hotel reservation. He had arranged, he said, to have Bobby check in on the property while she was gone. Dorothy said she would go. She called Claire afterward, and her voice was very quiet. He wants me out of state, Dorothy said. Yes, Claire said. He's going to do something while I'm gone. Yes, Claire said again. And we're going to let him. There was a pause. Then Dorothy said, in the tone of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the right moment, "You'd better get busy, baby." The 2 weeks before the Scottsdale trip were among the most productive of Claire's life. She reached out to Marcus Webb, a senior paralegal at her firm who did freelance document research, and had more contacts in county clerk offices across Texas than anyone Claire had ever met. She told him to pull every document associated with the Calloway property going back 5 years, and to flag anything filed in the previous 60 days. She drove to Lufkin and spent an afternoon with Bobby, Dorothy's farmhand, who had been working the Calloway property for 22 years and had the kind of loyalty to the land and to Dorothy that doesn't require articulation. Bobby told her about the black F-250 that had come down the main drive 3 weeks earlier, a man he didn't know who had photographed the fence line and the barn and told Bobby to mind his business when asked to identify himself. Claire wrote down his description of the truck and the man. She contacted Renata Vasquez, an estate and fraud attorney in Austin whose name she had encountered in 2 separate professional contexts, both times in the same sentence as the phrase, "She does not lose." She gave Renata a summary of what she suspected and asked her to be on standby. And then, on the morning of February 14th, Claire drove to DFW Airport. She told Dorothy she wanted to see her off. She did not tell Richard or Sandra she was coming. She arrived at the gate 30 minutes before departure and stood near the wall of windows overlooking the tarmac, close enough to observe but not so close as to invite conversation. She watched Richard. He was doing what people do when they are waiting for something to begin. restless with a controlled surface, checking his phone, scanning the departures board, his big hands moving in and out of his coat pockets. Sandra stood beside him with a composure that had the tight, managed quality of someone who has rehearsed it. The Louis Vuitton tote on her shoulder was new. Claire had never seen it before. Dorothy stood between them looking small and neat, her silver hair pinned up, her old leather suitcase at her feet. She was holding the suitcase handle with one hand and Claire's hand with the other, and she looked at Claire with an expression that said everything that needed to be said between them without using a single word. The gate agent called pre-boarding. Richard kissed his mother's cheek and stepped back. Sandra gave Dorothy a brief, precise hug. The hug of a woman completing a necessary task, and turned toward the exit. Richard followed. And as he turned, with his back to his mother and his voice lowered only slightly, in the way of a man who has stopped remembering that there are other people in the world, he said to Sandra, "Leave her here. I'll call the gate agent. The flight'll take care of her. We gotta beat traffic back or the notary closes at 5. Claire heard every word. She stood at the window and did not move for a moment. She watched Dorothy walk to the gate agent without looking back, her shoulders straight, her chin up, the old leather suitcase rolling behind her. She watched the jet bridge close. And then she walked to the parking garage and sat in her car in the fluorescent quiet and took 3 careful, measured breaths before she picked up her phone. She called Bobby first. He confirmed within 4 minutes that a white sedan he didn't recognize was parked at the end of the Calloway main drive. She called Marcus second. She gave him the property's legal description and told him to prioritize the title search for anything filed in the past 30 days. She called her mother in Oregon third. She told Patricia everything she knew. She asked her not to contact Richard until given the go-ahead. Marcus called back in 90 minutes. A deed transfer had been filed with Angelina County 9 days earlier. The grantor was Dorothy Mae Calloway. The grantee was Pineland Resources TX LLC, a limited liability company incorporated 11 weeks prior. The listed sale price was $1.4 million. The notary was a woman named on Denton Cole's firm website as a legal assistant. The signatures had been witnessed by 2 people whose names appeared nowhere in any document associated with Dorothy Calloway's actual legal history. Claire sat in the parking garage for a long time. The concrete smell of it. The distant sound of a jet. The flicker of a fluorescent tube 2 spaces down. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life. The specific crystalline clarity of it. The way time seemed to slow when the worst thing you suspected turns out to be exactly true. She thought about what Dorothy had told her once, when Claire was 11 years old and crying about something that had happened at school. Dorothy had dried her tears with the hem of her apron and said, "Baby, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. The ones who yell when they're mad, and the ones who wait. The ones who yell feel better for about a day. The ones who wait win." Claire put her car in gear and drove to Lufkin. She spent the next 4 days in motion, quiet and deliberate. She said nothing to Richard. She checked in on the farm through Bobby. She spoke with Dorothy every evening, Dorothy, who was in Scottsdale ordering room service and watching cable news and sounding, when she described the situation to Claire each night on the phone, like someone who has been waiting a long time for a slow-moving storm to finally arrive and is simply relieved it has. "He forged my signature," Dorothy said on the second night, in a voice that contained no surprise and very little anger, only a kind of heavy, exhausted clarity. "Yes," Claire said. "I've been his mother for 49 years, Dorothy said. A pause. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Claire said. "That's my job. Your job is to stay in Scottsdale, order the good steak, and let me work." Another pause. Then Dorothy said, almost to herself, "I brought the original deed, you know, tucked under the lining of the suitcase, where I keep Gerald's important letters." Claire closed her eyes. "I know, Grandma. I figured," Dorothy said. "If he was going to try to take the land, he should have to do it while I was literally sitting on top of the proof that it's mine." On the 5th day, Claire sat across from Renata Vasquez in her glass-walled office in downtown Austin and spread the documentation across the conference table. Marcus had compiled a preliminary package: the fraudulent deed, the LLC formation records, the notarization, the timeline. Renata reviewed it for 45 minutes without speaking. Then she took off her reading glasses and looked at Claire. "First-degree felony," she said. Elder financial abuse under Texas Penal Code Section 32.53. Value of the property is well above the $250,000 threshold. Combined with the forgery charge and the fraudulent notarization, we're looking at a serious criminal matter. But before we go to the DA, we need the forensic examination of that signature, and we need to trace the LLC beneficiaries definitively. Marcus is working the LLC, Claire said. How quickly can we get a forensic examiner? I have a former FBI documents analyst in Houston, Charles Webb. He's done work on 3 of my cases. He's thorough, he's credible, and he'll withstand cross-examination. She paused. How would you like to proceed? We can go to the Angelina County Sheriff today. Or we can file the civil petition to void the deed, secure the lease pendants to lock the property, and build the criminal referral on top of that foundation. Claire thought of Dorothy's voice on the phone. The ones who wait win. We build first, she said. I want everything locked down before he knows we know. Renata looked at her for a moment. Your grandmother raised you right. Yes, Claire said. She did. What followed over the next 6 weeks was a process of legal construction so methodical and comprehensive that Renata would later describe it to a colleague as one of the cleanest fraud cases she had ever seen assembled before a filing. Charles Webb's forensic report ran 32 pages and established beyond any reasonable technical challenge that the signature on the Angelina County deed was not Dorothy Mae Calloway's, that it had been traced from a prior document Dorothy had legitimately signed, likely a utility agreement from 2021. The technique was distinctive and the evidence was photographic. Marcus traced Pineland Resources TX, LLC through its registered agent to a holding structure that listed Richard Dean Calloway as its sole beneficial owner, with Sandra Calloway named as a co-applicant on the LLC's operating account at a regional bank in Frisco, Texas. He also traced the land developer behind the purchase offer, a regional firm called Meridian Land Partners, and confirmed that they had communicated with Denton Cole's office, not with Dorothy Calloway directly, at any point in the transaction. Bobby gave a sworn affidavit about the unidentified vehicle photographing the property. Harold Briggs gave a recorded statement about the inquiry from Denton Cole. Claire's documentation, the 2-year timeline she had compiled, the dates of Richard's visits, the pattern of Sandra's systematic undermining of Dorothy's perceived competence, was organized into a narrative exhibit that told the story of the scheme from inception to execution with the kind of clarity that juries and judges respond to. Renata filed the civil petition on a Tuesday morning. The lease pendants was recorded with Angelina County the same day. Meridian Land Partners, which had already wired a substantial earnest money deposit to Pineland Resources TX, LLC based on Richard's representations that the deed situation was settled, learned about the lease pendants from their own title company, and made a very unhappy phone call to Richard that afternoon. The weeks between the airport and the courtroom held a particular kind of tension, the tension of a trap that has been set and is waiting to be walked into. Claire worked long days and longer evenings. She ate at her desk. She drove to Lufkin twice more to review documents with Renata, and on both of those drives she took the farm road rather than the highway because she needed to see the land, to pass along the fence line and the tree rows and remind herself of exactly what they were fighting to protect. It was not abstract. It was never abstract. It was that specific red clay soil and those specific pine stands and that specific farmhouse with its porch where a woman had sat every evening for 30 years and watched her life in the form of light moving across fields. Marcus worked around the clock on the LLC documentation. He was a meticulous man who took a quiet, almost private satisfaction in finding the thread that unraveled something that had been designed to be unraveled proof. He found it in the operating account. The Frisco, Texas address. The same address as Richard and Sandra Calloway's mortgage. He cross-referenced the LLC's registered agent, a service firm in Dallas, with 2 other entities Richard had formed over the past decade, both dormant, both tied to real estate ventures that had gone nowhere. He found the email address used to form Pineland Resources TX, LLC and traced it to a Gmail account created 5 months before the deed filing, using a name that was not Richard Calloway's, but whose password recovery phone number was Richard Calloway's mobile. He wasn't careful, Marcus told Claire over the phone one evening, in the tone of a man who is professionally unsurprised by this. People who think they're getting away with something clean rarely are. They focus on the main structure and they get sloppy on the edges. That's where we find them, Claire said. Every time, Marcus said. Dorothy called Claire on the fourth day of the Scottsdale trip. She was sitting by the hotel pool, she said, watching a man across the way try to teach his toddler to kick in the shallow end. Her voice was steady and dry and faintly amused, as it usually was when she was describing something that contained both comedy and sadness in equal measure. Sandra texted me this morning, Dorothy said. Asked if I was enjoying myself. Put 3 little heart emojis after it. Claire said nothing. I texted back that I was having a wonderful time, Dorothy continued. Which is true, actually. The bed here is very comfortable. And the room service steak is excellent. A pause. Is everything on track? Everything is on track, Claire said. Good. Another pause, during which Claire could hear the distant sound of a child splashing. Claire. Yes. When this is over, and I mean all of it, the court, the whole thing, I want you to come up to the farm for a proper weekend. Not a work weekend. I want to make Sunday dinner and sit on the porch and not talk about any of it for at least 48 hours. Claire felt something tighten and then release in her chest. I would like that very much. Good, Dorothy said again. And then more quietly. Your grandfather would have been proud of you. Claire did not answer that for a moment. Outside her apartment window, Austin was doing what it always did in February, cold and bright and indifferent to the particular weight of any individual week. He would have been proud of you, Claire said finally, for knowing what to do before I did. Bobby was essential in ways that went beyond his legal affidavit. He was the eyes on the property during the weeks when it was most vulnerable, when the fraudulent deed had been filed and the transaction was nominally complete and Meridian Land Partners believed they owned what they had paid for. On 3 separate occasions during that 6-week period, he reported activity near the property's access road. A surveying crew that arrived on a Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours measuring the north acreage before Bobby informed them that the property was subject to active litigation and photographed their vehicle and their company name from the road. They left. They did not come back. Bobby told Claire about this incident on a Saturday afternoon when she was at the farm, sitting with him at the kitchen table over coffee while Dorothy was in the garden. He described it with his usual economy of language, but his jaw was set in a way that told her more than the words did. I've worked this land for 22 years, he said. Gerald hired me the year after they built the new house. Miss Dorothy brought me coffee at 7 a.m. every morning for 22 years. Not once did she miss it. He looked at his hands around the coffee mug. Nobody's surveying this land. Not while I'm standing on it. Claire looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Bobby. He shrugged the way a man shrugs when he believes thanks are beside the point. It's Miss Dorothy's land, he said simply. Always has been. Richard was served at his home in Frisco at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning. He answered the door in a gray robe and accepted the summons with the expression of a man who has just been informed that the bridge he has been standing on has been, in fact, burning for some time. He called Claire 40 minutes later. His voice moved between registers, anger, then something higher and thinner, a frequency Claire recognized from years of depositions as the sound of a person calculating exits and finding them closed. What in the hell is this, Claire? Mom signed that deed. We were helping her. She said she wanted to simplify. Richard. Her voice was the voice she used in depositions. Not unkind, not warm, simply clear and without openings. I'm going to tell you what the record contains. A forensic document examiner, formerly of the FBI's Question Documents Unit, has produced a 32-page report establishing that the signature on the Angelina County deed is not Dorothy Calloway's. It is a tracing from a document she signed legitimately in 2021. The forensic evidence is photographic and will withstand expert cross-examination. Dorothy's sworn affidavit states she never authorized a sale, never signed any deed, and was physically in Scottsdale, Arizona, on the date the notarization was witnessed. Hotel records and credit card statements confirm her presence. The notary is cooperating with investigators. Denton Cole's office is under state bar investigation. Meridian Land Partners is already in conversation with the litigation attorney about their misrepresentation claim against you. The LLC documentation has been fully traced. The bank account has been subpoenaed. She paused. You should retain an attorney immediately, Richard. Today. A silence that was very long and contained many things. You don't know what you've done, he said. His voice was thin now, the anger costume dropped. Just the fear, standing in a gray robe at 8:25 in the morning in Frisco, Texas, holding a 41-page document. I know exactly what I've done, Claire said. I've protected my grandmother's property. Goodbye, Richard. The day before the hearing, Dorothy called Claire from the farm. She was in the kitchen, she said. Claire could hear the particular acoustics of that kitchen, the way sound moved in it, a quality she had known since childhood. I ironed my dress, Dorothy said. The dove gray one. Gerald always said gray suited me. It does, Claire said. I'm not nervous, Dorothy said. I want you to know that. I know people expect an old woman in a situation like this to be nervous. But I'm not. I'm tired of this particular thing, and I want it to be over, and I trust Renata and I trust you. A pause. And frankly, I trust Harold Mercer. I've known of him for 20 years. He's a fair man. He is, Claire said. He's going to see exactly what the evidence shows. Good, Dorothy said. That's all I need. Another pause, and then in a voice so quiet Claire almost missed it. I used to think the hardest thing would be losing the land. It's not. The hardest thing is sitting across from your son, and knowing that he looked at everything you built and saw nothing but a dollar amount. That's what I have to sit with. She was quiet for a moment. But I'll sit with it on my own porch on my own land, for the rest of my life. And that's something. Yes, Claire said. It is. The courtroom in Lufkin was full on the morning of the hearing. It had the specific, weighted quality of a room where people have gathered to witness something they believe matters. The oak benches creaked. The overhead lights cast the flat, even illumination of institutional spaces. Beneath those lights, Dorothy Mae Calloway sat at the plaintiff's table in a dove-gray dress with her hands folded and her eyes forward, looking no more agitated than she looked on any other morning of her life. Richard sat at the defendant's table with his Dallas attorney, Barry Finch, a man whose suits communicated expense and whose face communicated the particular confidence of someone who has talked his way out of many rooms. Sandra sat beside Richard in a cream blazer, jaw set. She did not look at Dorothy. Judge Harold Mercer entered at 9:15. He was a large, measured man with reading glasses on a lanyard who moved through the courtroom with the unhurried gravity of someone who has never once doubted that the room will wait for him. He arranged his papers, reviewed the folder on his bench for 90 seconds of absolute silence, and then looked up. We're here in the matter of Calloway versus Calloway and Pineland Resources TX, LLC, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who chooses his words carefully because they carry weight in the rooms where he speaks them. I have reviewed the submissions, the forensic examination, all affidavits, and the financial documentation. I want to make clear to all parties before we hear argument that the court has formed preliminary conclusions. Counsel will have the opportunity to address the record. Barry Finch made a competent and professional argument. He challenged the conclusiveness of the forensic examination. He suggested that Dorothy Calloway had, on multiple prior occasions, expressed a desire to reduce her property management burden. He argued that the transaction had been conducted in what his client believed to be good faith. He said these things with the polished assurance of a lawyer who is accustomed to being believed, and had not yet understood that this was a room in which the evidence was doing all the talking that mattered. Renata Vasquez spoke for 22 minutes. She was precise and almost entirely without theatrical flourish, because she had learned long ago that when the facts are this clear, ornamentation is a distraction from devastation. She presented Charles Webb's forensic report. She presented Dorothy's affidavit and the hotel records confirming her presence in Arizona. She presented the LLC documentation, the bank records, the chain of communication with Meridian Land Partners. She presented Bobby's affidavit about the unidentified vehicle. She presented Harold Briggs's recorded statement. She presented Claire's 2-year timeline. And then she set a single document on the exhibit table and said, Your Honor, this is the original deed to the Calloway property, 340 acres in Angelina County, Texas, issued in 1975 and maintained in Dorothy Mae Calloway's personal possession continuously since that date. It was in her possession during the period in which a fraudulent copy, bearing a forged version of her signature, was being filed with this county. My client carried it to Arizona in her luggage. She has never relinquished it and never authorized any transfer of the property it represents. Judge Mercer picked up the deed. He held it for a long moment, looking at it the way people look at things that are older and more honest than the events surrounding them. Then he set it down, removed his reading glasses, and looked at Richard Calloway. Richard's face had gone the color of old clay. He was looking at the original deed the way a man looks at the thing that unmakes him, and he could not look away from it. "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, "this court has before it evidence of a forged deed, a fraudulent notarization, and a shell corporation created for the sole purpose of executing an unauthorized below-market transfer of your mother's property, while she was deliberately removed from the state. The forensic analysis is unambiguous. The affidavit of the grantor is unambiguous. The financial trail is unambiguous." He paused. He let the silence do its work. "The motion to void the deed transfer is granted. The Angelina County filing is hereby expunged. The property remains the sole and clear title of Dorothy Mae Calloway." He looked at his papers. "Additionally, this matter is referred to the Angelina County District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The evidence before this court is sufficient to support charges of forgery in the first degree, fraudulent notarization, and elder financial abuse under Texas Penal Code Section 32.53. The district attorney will determine the scope of prosecution." He looked at Richard one final time with the expression of a man who has been shown something that has cost him something, a degree of faith perhaps in what families are supposed to be. "Mr. Calloway, you attempted to steal from a woman who spent her entire life building something permanent, and you did so while manufacturing the fiction that she was too confused to understand what was happening, and while arranging to have her removed from the state on a manufactured pretense. This court has no jurisdiction over your relationship with your mother. But I would observe that the record in front of me describes a scheme of considerable deliberateness and considerable cruelty, directed at a person who trusted you." He closed the folder. "Court is in recess." The room exhaled. Not loudly, not the way movie courtrooms exhale with applause and exclamations, but the sound of 40 people releasing a breath they had been holding produced something real and audible in that old room with its oak benches and its wax and paper smell, and Dorothy Mae Calloway sat in the center of it, perfectly still, and did not cry. She turned in her chair and looked at Claire, who was sitting directly behind her. Claire's eyes were bright with tears. She was not quite crying. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter for a moment, and then she nodded, once slowly, the way she nodded when a thing she had always known was finally confirmed out loud. Renata leaned close and said something quietly. Dorothy almost smiled. The criminal proceedings moved with the efficiency that serious evidence makes possible. Richard Calloway was arrested at his Frisco home 14 days after the hearing. The charges were forgery in the first degree and elder financial abuse, both felonies carrying the potential for substantial prison time. Sandra Calloway was charged as an accessory. Denton Cole surrendered his law license and was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. The notary entered a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. Meridian Land Partners, which had paid earnest money into Pineland Resources TX, LLC based on Richard's representations of clean title, filed a civil misrepresentation suit against Richard for the full amount plus damages. That lawsuit, combined with Barry Finch's legal fees, which were substantial and required large upfront retainers, began a financial unraveling that had, in truth, been building for years beneath the surface of Richard and Sandra's carefully maintained lifestyle. The house in Frisco went on the market in April. Their son was not re-enrolled in private school for the fall semester. A Louis Vuitton tote, the camel-colored one Claire had noticed at the airport gate, appeared on a Facebook marketplace listing in Plano for $250, flagged as gently used. The listing was removed within an hour, but Claire had already seen it and recognized it, and she sat for a moment with the recognition before she closed the browser and went back to work. Richard ultimately entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of felony fraud after 9 months of proceedings, during which his legal defense consumed the majority of the family's liquid assets. He received 5 years of supervised probation, mandatory restitution, and was required to formally waive any future claim to the Calloway property or estate. Sandra received probation. Both of them left the courthouse on the day of sentencing looking like people who have discovered that the architecture they built their lives on was never structural. Denton Cole received 18 months in a federal facility after an expanded investigation revealed that the Calloway case was not isolated. 2 other East Texas families were identified as victims of similar schemes. Fraudulent transfers engineered through Cole's referral network with regional developers. Both families were in the process of recovering their properties when Cole was sentenced. The land developers at Meridian Land Partners wrote off the Calloway deal and moved on, as land developers do. The Calloway farm remained what it had always been, 340 acres of East Texas soil and pine and memory, owned free and clear by the woman who had devoted her life to it. Dorothy Mae Calloway spent the summer after the hearing the way she had spent every summer of her adult life. She was up before the sun. She walked her fields in the early light, in the hour when the dew was still on the grass and the mockingbirds in the tree line were conducting their daily argument and the air smelled of pine and clay and the particular clean earth smell of a morning that belongs entirely to itself. She checked on the cattle. She kept her kitchen garden. She exchanged pleasantries with Bobby, who arrived each morning at 7 and left each evening at 5 and who had, in the weeks following the court hearing, been given a raise significant enough to make him go quiet for a moment before he accepted it. In the evenings, Dorothy sat on the wraparound porch in the same cane-back chair she had sat in for 30 years, with a glass of sweet tea and the long low gold of the East Texas evening spread across her fields, and she was at peace in the specific, earned way of a person who has held on to something important through a long fight and has not lost it. Claire drove up from Austin most weekends. She and Dorothy would sit on the porch together in the warmth of those summer evenings, and Dorothy would talk about the land the way she had always talked about it, as a living thing with a history and a future, not a commodity with a price. She told Claire where Gerald had wanted to put the second barn. She showed her which fence line had been standing since the original family owned the property. She explained, one afternoon, walking the southwest corner with Claire beside her, why she had chosen this particular stand of pines for Gerald's grave, because it was the corner of the property that caught the last light of the afternoon, and Gerald had always liked being in the last light. In the year that followed the hearing, Dorothy Mae Calloway did something she had been meaning to do since Gerald died but had never quite found the right moment for. She had the southwest corner of the property properly fenced and landscaped around Gerald's grave, with a low stone wall and a gate, so that the area felt intentional rather than simply chosen. She planted yellow roses along the fence line, not because they were Gerald's favorite exactly, but because they were the color the sky turned above the loblolly pines in the late afternoon, and that had been Gerald's favorite thing to look at. She had the farmhouse's wraparound porch refinished that spring. New boards where the old ones had begun to give, new paint in the same white she had always used, new ceiling fans to move the summer air. She kept the cane-back chair in exactly the same position it had always occupied, because some things are worth preserving with precision. Bobby got that raise and a formal employment contract, and a small parcel at the north edge of the property that Dorothy had deeded to him outright, 2 acres with a site plan for a house, should he ever want to build. He had looked at the deed for a long time when she handed it to him, and he had not said much because Bobby rarely said much, but Dorothy understood what the silence meant and she received it accordingly. Patricia flew down from Oregon in June and stayed for 3 weeks. She and Dorothy painted the kitchen together one afternoon, the same shade of pale yellow it had always been, standing on step stools and talking about their lives the way women talk when they are doing something with their hands and do not have to look at each other. I see, Gerald. I see your mother learning to ride a bike on that dirt road. I see the summer you were 7 and you fell in the pond and came up muddy and laughing. She picked up her sweet tea. A number doesn't hold any of that. Land does. The mockingbirds were in the tree line again, insistent and various, making their borrowed music from everything they had ever heard. The Calloway farm is still there. The red clay soil still grows soybeans in the lower fields. The cattle herd is healthy. The pond is the color of iron in the morning light. The farmhouse porch wraps all the way around, and in the evenings, when the light goes gold and the mockingbirds are arguing in the tree line and the sweet tea is cold, Dorothy Mae Calloway sits in her cane-back chair and watches the fields she has always known and the life she has always lived and the land she has always owned, and she is not angry and she is not afraid and she is not done. Nobody, said Dorothy Mae Calloway, in the voice of a woman who has held on to something important through a long fight and does not intend to let go of it now, is ever going to take that from me again. And in the East Texas evening, with the last light going gold across 340 acres of land that bore her name and always would, no one did.